Hi everybody, let me know when you can see, and of course indeed, when you can hear me. I'm afraid it's another wet one today, but I'm not going to let that put us off. Just put that down for a second so I can just get a sip of water. Hello Ronnie Lynn. Ronnie, good to see you, albeit in the rain. And Susan's with us as well. Thank you Susan for your nice message on PayPal this week. Appreciate that, thank you. And Tasha Pat is here. Hi, can you just hear me? Let me know if you can see and hear me, okay? Just so that I know we've got sound levels blazing. Oh, no, very nice. Nice for some in North London. So Leslie's stolen our sunshine, but she's just been all nice to me today, and make up for the rather miserable weather with your kindness and good wishes. I am glad it's sunny where you are, Leslie. Hello, Leslie, Emily, and Carol. Hi, how's it going? I can't see that because it's against the white wall, but it'll come up in a minute who I'm talking to there. So hello for Erin and Carol. Brilliant, you can see and hear us. That's brilliant. Something designs, actually. Lilac Daisies Designs. Is that right? Hello, Marlena. Thank you very much for your generous support. Much appreciated. Hope you enjoyed all things May Day related. So yeah, I've positioned it wrong because you're against. If we turn you around, put you against this door, so we can get the chat on there. Oh, well, no, that's use your brain, young man. Right, there we go. That's better. Adrian is from Boston. Hello, Adrian. No sun. Deborah Harson's ready. Hello there. How's it going? Lovely to have you on board. So let me now see what. Read it out properly. So it's Lilac Daisies Designs. How lovely. Tell us about Lilac Daisies Designs. I've got a couple of minutes before I go live. So hello, Trish. Thank you, as ever, for your support. Do M&M, good out. Give everybody an idea of what it is that you do at Lilac Daisies Designs whilst we just wait for people to come on board. Hello, Diane Reid. Lovely to have you on board as well. It's a shame we're in slightly wet weather today, but not to worry. We're not going to let that worry us. We don't let the weather get in the way. And Martin James Kelly from Canada. Hello, Martin. Good of you to have us. Good of you to join us, rather. Not have us. It's awful, doesn't it? Good of you to have us. So, I missed the tour when you were saying thank you. Oh, okay. That's okay. Let me try and do that. Move you back onto the door so I can see. There we go. Hello, Laurie JH. Lovely to have you on board. And so I think we're about 5 o'clock. So, no Mrs. John today. M&M is Marlena. Oh, how fantastic, Marlena. So, I think, have you changed your handle? Anyway, never mind. And Singing Cheryl is on as well to serenade us. Our chanteuse is here. So, fantastic. Okay, so I think we're going to kick off. And we're here today in Kings Manor. We're starting off. And I'm going to give you a whiz round. And we're going to talk about life in medieval York. And just some sort of thoughts that have kind of, as ever, there's always different ways of telling different stories. So I'm going to try and tell a story in a slightly different way today. And it's a bit like, I think it's sort of contemporary things really. It's about how the rich and the powerful sort of decisions impacted really on the everyday city. So we're here inside King's Manor, which is a beautiful former royal palace, once the home of the Abbot of St Mary's. And when we kind of take in this beautiful medieval building, it's kind of easy to forget how much royal power was once concentrated on this spot, because in the late medieval period, this wasn't just a handsome building, it was the headquarters of the Council of the North, the King's watchdog in the region. I'll just spin you around again. And that crest you can see up there, very faded, is the crest of the Council of the North. So in the 1470s, the man who dominated this place was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future King Richard III, he of Shakespearean fame. So Richard spent years here ruling the north on behalf of his brother, King Edward IV. He held court, settled disputes, rewarded loyalty, punished rebellion. The great northern magnates, the Percy family, the Nevilles, the Scropes, all came here to negotiate, to scheme, to pledge their support. Now, ordinary people really saw Richard himself, but they absolutely felt the consequences of the decisions made inside these walls. Hello, Natalie. Because royal control didn't arrive as a kind of friendly suggestion. It arrived as laws, levies, taxes, summonses. And royal generosity, such as it was in medieval England, was mostly theoretical. Now, one of the biggest burdens placed on York citizens was the cost of defending the city. We're all about defence costs, right? So York's medieval walls were expensive to maintain. So when the king demanded, sorry, let me just get through this door, my brully. It's not a very good brully to get through doors, but it is a good one for keeping my kit dry. So when the king demanded stronger defences, new towers, repaired gates, deeper ditches, the money didn't come from royal coffers. It came from levies on ordinary people. If you lived here, you paid for the walls. And when danger came, you didn't just trust. You didn't have to just, sorry, tripping over words. When the danger came, it wasn't simply a case of funding the defences, you had to man them too. So we're going to head up and have a little walk on the walls. It's a rather rainy day. And we're going to talk about the kind of obligations. So starting at the top there, we've got kind of royal control imposing laws, levies. That's devolved regionally to the king's brother in the north. So we've got the Council of the North is imposing royal control. But that's still kind of distant. So now we're going to kind of move on to more of the kind of city control. And of course, that first of all starts with its defence. So when the king looked north and talked about controlling Scotland, the reality for the people of York was simple. They paid for the walls, they manned the walls, and they lived with the consequences of every royal decision. And that brings us to our kind of next chapter, if you like. Because when medieval kings tried to dominate Scotland, York found itself in the front line. So when medieval kings talked about conquering, controlling Scotland, the reality for the people of York was really rather different. Sorry. For the crown, it was a strategy. Borders, diplomacy, prestige, narrow gateways that I can't get my brolly through. For ordinary folk here, it meant something more immediate. Fear, cost, and of course, obligation. I'll come through here because the signal does tend to drop a little bit. Ooh, that's a big clang. So we'll try and get my brolly down because it's not too bad, the rain. Because every time the king pushed north, the Scots pushed back. And York was the biggest, richest target south of the border. And also kind of close as well. So we kind of suffered from proximity. And remember, York had no standing army, no permanent garrison, no soldiers waiting in barracks. If danger came, it was the people of the city, bakers, brewers, carpenters, coopers, who had to defend it. So York's relationship with Scotland in the medieval period wasn't kind of abstract politics. It was constant physical anxiety. From the 1200s right through the 1500s, the North lived with the knowledge that the border was porous, armies were mobile, and a warning could come at any moment. And without a standing army, the defence of the city fell upon the ordinary people. So after the English defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce pushed deep into northern England. They weren't just raiding farms and stealing cattle. They were burning villages, taking hostages, demanding huge ransoms. And in 1319, the danger became terrifyingly real. The Scots slipped past English forces and marched straight on towards York. The city bells rang out. How's timing for that? So spin you out to the Minster. And every able-bodied man was expected to take up arms. Shops closed, gates barred, the whole city braced for attack. And then came the disaster at Myton. The Archbishop of York, sorry, just busy on the wall, so I'm just waiting for people to come through. William Melton, desperate to stop the Scots, gathered a militia of clergy, monks, friars and townsmen. A force of the willing, or even maybe perhaps unwilling, but certainly not a crack force, certainly not a trained force. So I'm just getting through some narrow bit with my umbrella. Sorry, I'm speared. That's it. That's it. That should be the worst bit now. Sorry. It's so narrow up there. Of course, this brolly, I need to keep my kit dry, is wide in the space we're going through. So yeah, not a trained force by any means. They marched out in their white robes. They were mostly clergy, as I say. And of course, they were massacred. So many churchmen died in that battle, it became known as the White Battle. Imagine being in York that day, hearing the bells as we do now, seeing smoke on the horizon, knowing the army that had been sent to protect you had been wiped out, and knowing that if the Scots kept marching, you'd be the one standing on the walls with a bow in your hand. So as we kind of lean out of the kind of ramparts, we can kind of get a sense, just an ordinary working guy, suddenly it's his job to use this position to defend York from the Scots. Now this is not a one-off. Throughout the 1300s and the 1400s, the Scots raids were a grim fact of life. Sometimes full armies, sometimes fast-moving bands of horsemen could appear, burn and vanish before the city even had time to react. But York's response was always the same. Ring the bells. Muster the citizens. Pray the Scots turn back. And because the threat was so unpredictable, the city had to maintain a constant state of readiness. Watchmen posted on the walls every night. Gates locked at curfew. Citizens expected to keep weapons in their homes, not for hunting, but for defence. And this is the world we're walking through right now. A world where the walls weren't just a symbol, they were a lifeline. A world where the safety of York depended not on soldiers, but on bakers, brewers, carpenters and coopers. In a world where the line between everyday life and sudden danger was really thin. Thank you, Nathan, it's very kind of you. So as we walk along the walls, we'll start looking out across the rooftops when we get around this corner. But obviously we're in spring now and we've got lots and lots of greenery. But in the 1400s, these streets were full of men tied to powerful families. The Percys, the Nevilles, the Scropes, the great northern magnates who controlled this land, justice and military power. And when those families fell out with each other or with the king, it wasn't just noblemen who suffered. They called on their tenants, their retainers, their kin, and ordinary Yorkshiremen. All were dragged into the conflict. York became a political prize in the War of the Roses. Armies marched through the region. The city prepared for sieges, reinforced the gates, kept the walls manned. And again, it was the citizens who stood here on these very stones, defending their homes. This wasn't a world where you could say no. If your lord called you, you went. If the city summoned you, you turned up. Military service wasn't a choice. It was an obligation woven into everyday life. And then came Towton. Thank you, Marlene. Just a few miles from here on Palm Sunday, 1461, the armies of Lancaster and York met in a snowstorm. It was the largest and the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Around 50,000 men took part, and perhaps some say up to 20,000 died. The snow turned red, bodies piled in drifts. And in a kind of shocking break with tradition, the order was given: no prisoners. Men who surrendered were cut down. Those who fled were hunted across the fields. The survivors staggered back towards York, wounded, frozen, traumatised. Imagine standing on these walls watching the remnants of that army limp back into the city. The fear, the grief, the uncertainty. Towton wasn't just a battle, it was a catastrophe that reshaped the whole region. And again, it was ordinary people who paid the price. So we're now looking down the length of the wall there, and we see below us the ditch, the moat area. I want to talk about the watchman, because this was the workplace of the night watchman, ordinary men doing one of the most important jobs in the city. Every night the gates were locked, curfew was called, and watchmen patrolled the walls, looking for fire, for thieves, or danger from the outside. This wasn't a glamorous job. It was cold, like today. It was lonely, unlike today, and exhausting, totally unlike today. And the penalties for failing were severe. If you fell asleep on watch, you could be fined heavily. In times of war, the punishment could be imprisonment, sometimes even death. Because if one man nodded off, the whole city was at risk. So Sunday afternoons weren't for relaxing in medieval York, no. They were for archery practice. A medieval kind of version of mandatory fun. Hello Russia, hello Popov, how's it going? And remember, these weren't soldiers. They were bakers, they were coopers, they were brewers, they were tailors, people like us. Mincer, can I come into you? So by law, every able-bodied man had to own a longbow. And not just to own it, but also to practice with it. The city set up butts, practice targets outside the walls, and the men were expected to turn up and shoot every Sunday. If you didn't, you could be fined. If you couldn't afford a bow, the city might provide one, because military readiness was a civic duty. The longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of the idea that every man was a part of the defence of the realm. And it worked. English armies dominated European battlefields for a century because of the longbow. And that skill was built right here in places like York by ordinary men practicing week after week. So as we walk this stretch of wall, think about what it represents. Not kings, not knights, not professional soldiers, but the people of York, men who worked all day, raised families, paid taxes, and then when danger came, climbed these steps and stood their ground. This wall is a monument to civic duty, collective responsibility, and the idea that the safety of a city rested on the shoulders of its citizens. Good missile, I like that. So we're just going to come to this end section. Of course, I'll give you the view of the Minster. I'm trying to keep going a little bit because we've got a rather nasty, rainy, you see the grey skies now, but I like that, a nice sourdough, yeah. Chuck bread buns at them off the walls. And of course, it wasn't just arrows, there's all manner of things, projectiles that you could be throwing across. So, that might be things like stones. Hot gravel, that was kind of popular one. So heat gravel up in big barrels and kind of tip it over. It's great because there's lots of it, so you don't need much hot gravel to to take your mind off things. Boiling water, hot oil. You know, so there's lots and lots of kind of variety. You really kind of mix it up a little bit in terms of what you can do when it's your job to be peering over here and trying to keep that lot out of the way. So yeah, I'm not sure that sourdough was a commonly used one, but I dare say it could have had its place. To get me overbaked and look at those flowers. Oh, they're beautiful. Look at that. Let's try and frame that. Let's try and get a shot there for you. I've always got time for a photograph, right? How is that? Actually, that. How's that? That would have got postcard of the week one time, wouldn't it? In Hey Yo days. There we go. So we're just going to come off the end of the walls, and then we'll go and talk and walk around the Minster. Hopefully it's not raining, and get rid of this blooming brolly, and just focus on. You hear that scraping sound? That's my brolly trying to negotiate through a space that's really too small for it. You want to come through? So we're just going to go down through Monk Bar now, and then we're going to talk about religious control, because of course, you know, the military fear was one thing, and military duty, but there's a power that's greater than kings, and that, of course, is the power of the church. And it's worth reminding, I know I've said this, and everybody believed that the focus of this life was to attain salvation in the next. So whatever this life threw at you was far less scary and far less ultimately important than what was going to happen in the next life. So I'm just going to take my brolly down, then we're going to whip down, talk about how the one likes to be a pikeman. Buffer, because we went down that spit and there's basically no signal. Buffer, because we went down that spit and there's basically no signal whatsoever. Stone that old does not allow for. So we should be back by now. So yeah, just repeating Alex's question there, was just saying yes, of course there were slight differences in military service. If you're highborn, you'd be trained to be a knight, fighting in armour and horseback. Lowerborn, you're likely to be a pikeman in battle, so part of the infantry, or perhaps an esquire, providing services to a knight, arranging their kit, looking after horses and this, that and the other. But it's all the same form of service, just sort of different levels. Good. So, okay, so we're talking then now about a power that's greater than kings, and that, of course, is the church. So royal authority kind of reached into York from a distance through councils, taxes, levies, but the church reached into people's lives every single day. From the moment you woke, said a few bells on this already, the days wasn't optional. Days wasn't optional. The church didn't just guide your soul, it regulated your schedule. And then there were tithes. Every household owed a tenth of its produce or income to the church. A tenth of your grain, a tenth of your wool, a tenth of your grain, a tenth of your wool, your eggs. They dealt with adultery, gossip, disputes over wills, marriage problems, sexual behaviour, slander, broken promises. You could be summoned. Your family had printing. Books were copied by hand. And the church decided who could read them and what they could contain. After printing arrived, the church tightened its grip. Every book had to be licensed. Every idea had to be safe. Everything and anything could smell of heresy, even a poorly phrased sermon. And this could bring down the full weight of ecclesiastical authority. So for the ordinary people of medieval York, the church wasn't simply the building here at the Minster or the parish church, it was the air that they breathed. But there's another kind of power as well that could descend on you without warning. A power that didn't care about your status, your piety, or indeed your connections. A power that terrified rich and poor alike. And that was disease. So I'll begin this part of things, which I've timed rather well, I think, outside the plague house. I've told you the ghost story here, so I'm not going to do the ghost story tonight, but just to remember, this is the house that's famous for the tale of the little girl, the last of her family to die here during the plague outbreak of 1603, up at that window. So a story is often told as a ghost story, but in truth it reflects something much more real. Countless people in York suffered exactly this fate as the authorities desperately tried to control the spread of disease. Because plague wasn't a single tragedy, it was recurring terror, a shadow that returned again and again across the centuries. The first great blow here came in 1349, when the Black Death reached York. It tore through the city at astonishing speed. Whole households vanished in days. Parishes were half emptied. Trade collapsed. Fields went unharvested. Some estimates suggest that a third to a half of the population died. Every street changed. Every family was touched. And then just 12 years later, in 1361, the plague returned, the so-called children's plague, because so many of the dead were the young. Those that had been born after the first outbreak and had no immunity to the plague. For the parents that had survived 1349, this must have felt like the world was ending all over again. And it didn't stop. The plague came back in the 1370s, the 1390s, the 1430s, the 1470s. Every generation lived with the knowledge that the next outbreak was not a question of if, but when. Even in the early modern period, the terror continued. In 1603, plague struck York again, and the death toll was catastrophic. Thousands lost, whole parishes hollowed out, a city economy buckling under the strain. And for many families, it was the worst outbreak they had ever known. And this is why the city's sort of public health controls were so severe. When plague appeared, houses were shut up, doors were nailed closed, windows barred, whole courtyards closed down, a warning mark painted outside, a watchman stationed to keep everyone in and everyone else out. Imagine the city nailing your door shut, not because you'd done anything wrong, but just because your neighbour had sneezed. So healthy or not, you were trapped inside with the disease. You couldn't work, you couldn't trade, you couldn't earn, yet the rent still had to be paid. The tithe still had to be found. Fear shaped everything. Fear of the disease, fear of the authorities, and fear, of course, of what came after death. Because when the plague swept through the city, when the bells tolled constantly and the neighbours vanished overnight, the threat of eternal damnation felt closer than ever. People came to the church. They confessed more urgently. They paid tithes more faithfully. They clung to the church's promises and warnings with renewed desperation. Plague was a physical crisis, but it was also a spiritual one. It tightened the church's grip on the conscience just as surely as it tightened the city's grip on movement. And from that kind of world of fear and confinement and enforced silence, another kind of power emerges. A power that didn't control bodies, but controlled ideas. Because in medieval York, it wasn't just movement that was regulated, it was knowledge itself. What you could read, what you could write, what you could say, what you were allowed to believe. So if the church tried to control what people believed, and the city tried to control what people did, there was still one realm that was harder to police. What people talked about. Because even in a world of censorship, licensing, and strict moral oversight, ideas had a habit of slipping through the cracks. Printing, though, changed everything. Before the 1470s, book was slow, expensive and tightly supervised, copied by hand. But once the presses arrived in England, ideas could move faster than the authorities could contain them. A single press could produce dozens of pamphlets in a city. Cheap, portable, easy to hide. Most were harmless. Sermons, almanacs, miracle stories, ballads, but some carried sharp edges. A pamphlet criticising a priest, a satire aimed at a civic officer, a rumour about corruption, a theological argument that didn't quite match official doctrine. The church tried to license every text. The city tried to regulate every printer. But one truth is simple. Once printing existed, control was never absolute again. And ideas didn't just travel on paper, they travelled in voices. In medieval York, power wasn't democratic in a modern sense, but it wasn't hidden either. The Commons, as in like the House of Commons, a select group of freemen gathered in public assemblies to watch their leaders swear oaths, read out the town's accounts, justify their decisions. It was politics as performance, a kind of medieval transparency where people's power came from watching, remembering, and holding officials to their promises. These gatherings were carefully choreographed, but they weren't silent. A murmur from the crowd could shift the mood. A raised eyebrow could signal disapproval. A shouted objection, rare, yes, unheard of, no, could force an alderman to issue a clarification. And even when the assembly stayed orderly, the real conversations happened afterwards, in the taverns, in the workshops, in the alleyways, in the guild halls, in the queues at the bakehouse, in whispered huddles behind market stalls from the plague. Especially if it involved dissected over an ale, with someone quietly suggesting that he'd strayed too close to heresy, or too close, perhaps, to hypocrisy. And once an idea was out, it travelled, not in straight lines, but in loops, in spirals, carried by people who had no power on paper, but enormous power in practice. The storytellers, the market women, the apprentices, the alehouse keepers, the men who stood at the gates and heard every rumour.
Where are we going? Hang on.
Yes, the guys who stood on the gates heard every rumour coming into the city. And this is kind of the weakness, ultimately, of any form of control. You can license books, but you can't license conversations. You could punish heresy, but you couldn't stop people thinking. You can regulate printing, but you can't stop a pamphlet being read aloud by a crowd who couldn't read at all. And so even in a world of kings, councils, churches, plague, regulations, ordinary people still found ways to encounter new ideas, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes dangerously. From here, then, we're going to move the story into another arena of power entirely. The world of markets, guilds, and economic control, where the rules of daily survival shaped what people could earn, what they could buy, and how they lived. If ideas could slip through the cracks, money rarely did. Because in medieval York, the most immediate form of control wasn't spiritual or political, it was economic. And nowhere was that clearer than in the price of food. So we're going to head into everyone's favourite, the Shambles. But the Shambles wasn't just a street of butchers. It was a regulated machine built to keep the city fed and to keep the authorities firmly in charge. Meat was expensive. You let me cross? Thank you, sir. Across the road there, yeah. But it's also volatile. And of course, the price of meat linked to harvests. In bad years, there's food for the cattle is more expensive, there's less hay, straw, so prices go up. So prices can be volatile, then as now. Food inflation, a very real thing. Too expensive, and the poor starved. There's no welfare state, of course. But too cheap, get a glut, and the butchers collapse. So the city has to step in. Officials inspect weights and measures. They check quality. They set maximum prices. They find anyone who cheated, stretched, watered down, or passed off good cuts as bad ones. Though quite how you kind of water down meat is a mystery best left, I think, unexplained. So we're going to move on from that one. So butchers obeyed because the city believed that controlling the price of food meant the controlling of the stability of the population. So it's a busy shambles, it's raining. And the shambles, of course, was really only the start. This was the street of the butchers, and so as a result, the most important guild in this area was the Guild of the Butchers. The Guild of the Butchers was very, very well known for its role in the Passion plays, the mystery plays, of doing the crucifixion play with buckets of blood. They kind of made it an absolutely horror fest, portraying the torture and execution of Christ. Very popular, right at the end of the plays, late at night, people were drunk. So the Guild of the Butchers were very much kind of exposed to the blood and guts, the reality of the world. But nonetheless, they were still dressed up in their robes as a guild. They still exercised control, thank you, Debbie, over their members. Because behind the scenes, real power lay with the guilds, organisations that controlled every trade. If you were a craftsman, you didn't simply make goods, you made them by guild rules. What you could produce, what you could charge, how many apprentices you could take, even the hours that you could work. For ordinary workers, wages were low and tightly managed. A weaver, a tapper, a cordwainer, a cooper, they all kept the city alive, but they rarely saw the wealth that their labour created. Their pay was fixed. Their opportunities were limited. And then at the top of the economic pyramid stood the merchant adventurers. We're on our way to see their hall. And they just make goods. They move them. Let me just try and get across the road without getting run over. That's lovely Thomas Herbert House. I was promised dry weather by BBC. I feel really rather short-changed with this weather today. I'm not at all happy with it. Shall we go that way or this way? I think we'll go this way. We'll probably just get more trapped down that way. So most adventurers controlled ships, the routes, the overseas markets. These guys bought cloth, wool, leather, and metalwork. And they bought it, importantly, directly from the local producer, from the artisan. So the women that were sitting at home with the children at their feet, spinning, carding, weaving, involved in what's known as piecework, in other words, you made a piece and sold it, their rates were fixed. They couldn't negotiate a price. They were simply told what the price was. And of course, the price always favoured the adventurers. The price was as low as they were able to do, so they could sell them on at enormous profits in places like Antwerp, in Hamburg, and in the Low Countries. So in Stefan's kind of part of the world, that's who was buying, produced here, sold over there. Yorkshire, a woolly colony, remember? West Yorkshire, on the Pennines. You can't farm it, it's solid stone, solid rock. But it's got two brilliant elements. It's incredibly good for sheep. They have grass that the sheep love. And because of the steep sides of the valley, fast moving, very soft water, so very, very good for cleaning the grease and the muck off the sheep's fleeces. So English cloth, Yorkshire cloth, was the best in the world. But the people involved in the production of it saw very little of these profits. The people that met and did the business in this hall were the ones who got rich. They controlled the supply chain. They controlled the export licenses. They controlled the flow of money into the city. And by doing that, they controlled wages at the bottom. A craftsman might spend a week on cloth. A merchant adventure could earn more in one voyage than a craftsman might make in an entire year. So that's the economic reality of medieval York. A city where price of meat kept the peace, and where guilds regulated every trade, and where the greatest wealth flowed not to the people who made things, but to the people who moved them. I'm just going to take a sip of water, and then we're going to head across to the castle. So hopefully you enjoy it. You kind of get the theme of this parallels with modern life. He's always the guy at the top. It does well off the sweat of the brow of the folk at the bottom. The powerful and the powerless. Tell me that's changed. I want to believe it's changed, but it sounds depressingly familiar to me. So we've talked about all these rules really. But of course, without control systems, what are rules if there aren't consequences? So, for all systems of power, the church, the guilds, the markets, the councils, there was one place in York that embodied the kind of final consequence of stepping out of line. The castle, that's where we're heading next. Clifford's Tower is the surviving bit of it, but of course it was a much, much bigger originally. And of course, originally the castle would have contained all manner of things that are not there today, including, of course, courts, prisons. So for medieval people, you didn't need to see inside to know what it meant. Its reputation travelled ahead of it. The castle was the city's reminder that authority didn't just guide or regulate, it could punish. And it could punish hard. So inside these walls, those walls rather, justice could be swift, physical, and very public. The castle had two courts, the prison and the instruments of interrogation. It was the end of the line for anyone who pushed too far. If someone said, the authorities want a word, you didn't ask which authorities, you started worrying. A medieval interrogation was not gentle. It could involve the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. Your wrists tied one way, ankles the other, and the rollers turned slowly, stretching joints, tearing ligaments. He didn't need to kill just to break your will. Or there's manacles, iron cuffs fixed high on a wall, a prisoner hanging by his wrists, toes barely touching or not touching at all. Minutes became agony, hours became torture, pain by gravity, pain by time. And there's thumb screws, two metal plates, a screw placed between them, a thumb inside, turn the screw, bone cracked long before the skin broke. Water torture, another option. Not drowning, that's far too quick. We save that for witches, just to prove they're innocent, of course. A cloth placed over the mouth, water poured slowly, so the victim felt they were drowning again and again. The body panics, the mind broke, no marks left behind. Say hello to YouTube. Hey, there we go. Thank you. So, yeah, you might remember waterboarding, notorious treatment of Iraqi prisoners of war in the Gulf War, even in the medieval period. As most good things were, I say good, as in most effective things in the world of torture were, there was nothing new whatsoever. Scavenger's Daughter, I don't know if you've heard of that one. This is the opposite of the rack. So not stretching, compressing. The body folded tightly, knees to the chest, head forced down, iron hoops locking everything in place. Blood vessels burst, breathing becomes a struggle. Agony turns inwards. And these methods weren't used on everyone, but the fact they existed at all was enough. Fear did most of the work. Now, punishment was designed to be seen. So torture, the preparation, that's the interrogation. Punishment was public. hands cut off for theft, ears nailed to the pillory, tongues split for false witness, branding irons marking the skin, whippings carried out in the streets, and the victim tied to a cart and dragged past their neighbours. The message was simple. Step out of line and the city will make an example of you. So just as a kind of reminder, we're going to have a little look, just because it's so nice, at the 18th century prison buildings. But these are just kind of nicer, slightly more modern, although still 300-year-old, version of the medieval courts and prisons that were here, because that was the point of castle. When the castles were put in, and castles were introduced by William the Conqueror, 1066, he conquered England, and then to hold this overseas territory, he built a network of castles across it. So castles hadn't been seen in England before this. You had wooden forts and everything, but castles was new. And a castle was a garrison, so a place for your soldiers, but also a place to detain, torture your enemies, a place of execution, a place of justice, administration. There's all these kind of purposes. So the castle was much, much bigger. That's just simply the central keep, the sort of secure area in the centre. It would have surrounded this entire area. So we're in the kind of castle area. So we're looking now at an 18th century prison. But it's the same idea. Prison in the 18th century, prison in the 15th century was the same. It wasn't for mercy, it was for waiting for trial, waiting for payment, waiting for judgment. And the castle's prison carried a deeper meaning. So castles, I say, were a French invention, the symbol of domination imposed upon the landscape. And the French had a certain kind of word for a cell. Have you heard of this before? It's called an oubliette. And an oubliette means, in French, to forget. A pit in the ground, a trapdoor above. You were lowered in or dropped in and left. No light, no space, no hope. But even the ordinary cells were grim, cold, cramped, airless, filthy. A debtor could rot for months. A thief could wait until a court sat. A woman accused of slander could be held until she agreed to public penance. The castle didn't need to kill you, simply to destroy you. But of course it was also a place of execution, and they could kill you. Hanging was the standard punishment for the crime City feared the most. Murder, robbery, arson, treason, repeated theft, offences that threatened order, property or authority to the crown. So executions were public because they were meant to be remembered. Crowds gathered not for bloodlust, but because they understood the message. This is what happens when you challenge the system. So the castle didn't need to be seen to be felt. It's a power that lived in rumour, in memory, in the stories parents told their children to keep them safe. It was the final expression of control in a city built in layers of authority. Royal, religious, economic, civic. So as we're kind of walking around the castle now, this is the place where all these powers converge. These are the temporal powers, the spiritual powers, of course, in the church, the minster, but the temporal powers, the earthly powers, were here. And this is where the consequences of any defiance were carved into the lives and, of course, the bodies of ordinary people. But even the castle, with its other, you got it now, yeah, with its cells, its chains, its gallows, was not the final fear in medieval life. Because punishment here really was only the beginning. Remember where we started? What we talked about? Belief in attaining salvation. So there's a very, very cruel form of double punishment at play here, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, Pauline. Whereby not only could he be punished for your sins in this life, and of course that could involve losing your life, but it also condemned you in the next life. So every sin, every defiance was believed to follow you beyond death, into a place where no lawyer, no alderman, no guildmaster, no wealthy patron could advocate on your behalf. Nobody could intercede apart from the church. And at the moment of death, the medieval imagination saw a reckoning, a judgment day. St. Michael the Archangel standing with a pair of scales going across the road. So we'll come across here. Are you familiar with the idea, the scales? So St. Michael places your sins on one side of the scales, your good deeds on the other, and no one knows which way the balance will tip. If it weighs on behalf of your sins, the very best you can hope for is a lengthy stay in purgatory. The worst, of course, is being conveyed straight to the very gates of hell. Conversely, if your soul, if your good deeds were light as a feather, you'd go the opposite way to heaven. But nobody would know until the last moment. So how could they take a chance? Demons whispered accusations. Angels argued back. But ultimately, it was a verdict without an appeal. If the scales tipped the wrong way, the soul fell not into darkness, but into fire. Where did they bury the remains with or without a head? It's interesting, Susan. If you're talking about people that had been done for mortal sins, there was the broken the Ten Commandments, so murderers, then they'd be buried in unconsecrated ground. There was no way back for them. It was beyond redemption. It's automatic place in hell. If you'd been guilty of a sin and executed for something that wasn't a mortal sin, then there was a way back. So, for instance, if you remember, the other week we had Dick Turpin, who was buried in even though he was guilty of theft, he wasn't guilty of murder, and so he was able to be buried in church grounds. So, depending on what you were executed for. But I say, if the scales fell the wrong way, that was it. And this sort of fear underpins everything in medieval society. The rules, the obedience, the confessions, the tithes, the dread of the castle, and the dread of the church all kind of rolls up into this idea of kind of authority. Because earthly punishment might scar the body, but divine punishment could claim the soul forever. And yet, for all that fear, people lived. Thank you, Dan. They worked, they laughed, they argued, they loved. They lent on family, on neighbours, on the small acts of kindness that pass quietly between ordinary people. And when the week got a bit much, a drink strong enough to take the edge off was sure to help. Because even in this kind of tightest systems of control, life found a way to slip through the cracks. And that's the thread from their world to ours. The powers above may change, but the people stay like us, sharing the same experiences, separated only by time. And I think the flow of a river is always a beautiful visual metaphor for time. It never stops moving. The same river that was moving through York in the medieval period is in front of us now. A collective, a humanity almost, of raindrops coming together to form a great river will then, of course, be reborn as rain evaporated and come back down as tiny raindrops, only once again to kind of join a community. So this endless circle. We tend to think of time in a linear way. We encourage to think about years, decades and centuries. But what is time? Time is simply a measure of how long it takes for us to spin our own axis and for the Earth to orbit around the sun. There is no linear concept of time. Simply that's how we make sense of the world. Time exists with us and without us. So this is the river that people stood by on the bad days, on the happy days, to hold hands, to search for the answers. Maybe something worse. But this doesn't change. The world doesn't change. People doesn't change. We are still subject to powers above us, to systems that wish to control and exploit us. And all we can do is keep together, look after ourselves and our own, put value in community, and believe the truth and goodness will out. And I think that's just as true now as it was in the medieval period. So thank you, everybody, for joining me in the wet. I'm at the top of my hour, and I'm ready to put my kit away, because I'm ready to put this brolly away. Not because I want to get rid of you guys, but because I'm sick of carrying this brolly around with the other hand. Gimbal work and brollies are not good bedfellows. But before I do, I say thank you to everybody who's joined us. Here I am in York, and as ever, it's been an absolute pleasure doing Live at 5 with you. Not sure where I'll be. I won't be in York next week. Been a busy week this week, so I won't have time to think about where else to go. But we'll be somewhere else outside York, and we'll see you again next week at 5. So thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing you. Be safe, everybody. Be kind. Look after each other. See you again. Bye-bye.